Hello and welcome. I'm Coach Al with Pursuit Athletic Performance. Listen, if you want to stay durable and be able to train, pile on the miles to lift your fitness and keep moving forward, and certainly age gracefully if you're getting a little bit older like I am, you've got to maintain good flexibility and mobility of the hips. Well, the work that I do as a functional range conditioning mobility specialist is focused not on improving passive flexibility of this anterior hip and hip flexors, but also improving control of the hip. So I'm going to share with you one way that I like to stretch and then strength train, focusing on the hip flexors. So I'm turning to the side here. I'm in this half kneeling position. We're going to focus specifically on the hip flexors, but we're going to do it in a way where we engage both the front and the back of the hip. So follow along with me and give this a try. This is a little bit of a tricky strategy to get a good feel for, so the more you practice it, the better you'll get at it. And remember, the goal here is not just passive flexibility, but strength and control at end range, both in the front of the hip and in the back of the hip through the glutes. So I'm coming into this half kneeling position. As I mentioned, we want to set up by getting the knee right below the hip. So we've got a nice straight line from knee to hip to shoulder. So we'll start here, and the first thing we'll do once we get into this position is move our pelvis around. This is always where I start. Even in my foundation program, we go through this process of anterior tilt to neutral to posterior tilt, really finding out and getting a good sense of where our pelvis is in space. In this exercise, we're going to focus on a posterior tilt to get maximum engagement of the glute. So once you've moved around a little bit, you get a sense of where that neutral is. It's a great exercise for anybody. I'm going to have you go ahead and come into neutral, and then we're going to tilt the pelvis posteriorly. You're going to tuck your tail underneath you, essentially. And then what we're going to do is create some engagement in the front of the hip and the back of the hip. We'll start with the back. So let's start with a posterior tilt. We're going to tuck our tail underneath. It should give you a rock hard glute on that down leg hip side. And then what I want you to do as you maintain that posterior tilt is push the hip and leg back, but not create any movement, any actual movements. You're trying to slide that knee back, which is quite difficult when maintaining that posterior tilt. Push that knee back. That really increases engagement on the back side. All right, now rest for a moment. We're going to do just the opposite. We're going to come back into that posterior tilt, and then I want you to drive the knee forward, but not actually move. So the first two reps in this exercise involve engagement in different directions, but not actual movement. What we're trying to do is upregulate, push that dimmer switch up to really engage tissue on both sides while we're in this posterior tilt. So here we go. Tuck the tail and then drive that knee forward. So you should really feel this tissue engage. Maintain the posterior tilt though. You should have really, really tight glute at this point. All right, let's rest for a moment. So it'd be a good idea to repeat that one more time. The next series, however, what we'll do is actually get some movement out of a change in focus or position. So let's do this. I'm going to come into that posterior tilt, tuck our tail, and then push the hip back. And by doing that, we get a little bit of an opening in the front of the hip. We're going to maintain that posterior tilt, push the leg back, and push us essentially into hip flexion, but maintaining that posterior tilt. Then we're going to shift our focus, maintain the tilt, drive the knee forward, and again, try to open the hips. So this time I'm pushing that knee forward, really, really working to open up that front of the hip. All right. So we'll pause there and then go to the other side. So the goal with this series is to create strength and control of the hip at the front and the back. This is sort of a kinetic stretching approach. And even though I'm not a certified kinetic stretch instructor, the concepts from progressive and regressive angular isometric loading come right in and apply in this situation. So let's go and work on the other side. If you're following along with me, first thing we want to do is get that knee under the hip. We're going to move around a little bit. There's our anterior tilt where we're sticking our tail out. Come into a posterior tilt. Make sure we get good engagement here. This is why I'm wearing my racing suit, so you can actually see what's going on in the middle. So we're going to tuck our tail and then try to drive that knee back, really engaging all those tissues through the back side. This takes a lot of mind-body connection to create that feeling we're looking for, which is full engagement of our hip as we drive the knee back. 15 to 20 seconds of that. You rest for a moment if you need to, and then tuck the tail again, posterior tilt, and then try to drive this knee forward. Drive it all the way forward, but not actually move. So counterintuitive, we're in a posterior tilt, we're squeezing here, but we're trying to really activate all this tissue here. All right, excellent. All right, here's we come into the portion of the movement where we're actually moving. So we'll start again by driving the knee back. This time we'll allow our hip to come forward. Remember, we're going to be somewhat limited in how far we can come because we've come into that posterior tilt. We've got full engagement of the back, but we're stretching the front. And of course, this is going to be loaded as well. Terrific strength training for flexion and extension of our hip. All right, here we go. Posterior tilt. Let's drive that hip back, so focus on pushing the knee back via engagement of the hip. Maintain that posterior tilt, tuck the tail. Come all the way forward as far as you can. I did some rear foot elevated split squat today and had a good quality run, so I'm a little short here for sure. Keep pushing that hip back. All right, let's keep that tilt. Now drive that knee forward. So we're dragging that knee forward, but also continuing to open up the hip, maintaining that posterior tilt. Really feel this entire anterior hip open up. All right, so 15 to 20 seconds in that position, or as much as feels comfortable for you. This is intense. This is not passive by any stretch of the imagination. The difference with this and simply passive stretching the hip, this actually works to create permanent change and really give you greater control of both flexion and extension of your hip. Give it a try.